Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at Hegel and the master-slave dialectic, or the lordship and bondage dialectic as it is called in the actual German translation. And we will be looking at Kojeve's reading, Alexander Kojeve's reading of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. So let's begin with Hegel and phenomenology itself. Before we can really jump into the dialectic and understand the relationship between the master and the slave, and what that means politically and culturally for us, we have to understand who Hegel is and what Hegel is doing. He was considered what we call a German idealist philosopher, and he was born in 1770 and died in 1831 in what is today part of Russia, a place called Prussia. So Hegel lived during, one could say, the height of the Enlightenment, and he very much thought of himself as an Enlightenment thinker, although he never used the term specifically. While Hegel himself had complicated feelings and thoughts about the Enlightenment, for instance, he felt that liberalism had an atomizing effect, meaning that it would destroy society by breaking it down to its smallest individual components, and therefore there would be a lack of totality or collectivity or community. He used the word spirit to describe the collective, but basically the two are synonymous. Nevertheless, I would consider him to be an Enlightenment thinker because he was very much concerned with questions of human freedom and human consciousness. Which brings us to his second most important point as a thinker, and that is his emphasis upon phenomenology or phenomena in terms of how we can understand ourselves. In fact, Hegel thinks of philosophy as simply thought, and thought in time. That is how he defines it. So he was interested in consciousness and human consciousness. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't a real physical material reality. He wasn't making that argument. He was an idealist in the sense that Plato was an idealist, in that, just like Plato, Hegel thought thoughts were real things. Thoughts had real impact on the world. They existed in a concrete way. So Hegel then is a German idealist philosopher. He is an Enlightenment thinker, we could say, and he's concerned with human thought and human freedom. Those are the things we have to remember about him as we start off. The other thing we need to know about Hegel is that he's incredibly important and incredibly influential. Not only historically speaking, beginning with his contemporaries, but he heavily influences Karl Marx. And in fact, Hegel's teleological or linear narrative kind of progressive description of history, he has a whole thing about how history will unfold through consciousness and result in an ultimate thing he calls absolute spirit, which is this kind of perfect utopian world in which everything is a part of this totality. Oftentimes we think of Marx's description of his own materialist dialectic, the movement through history of class struggle, which ultimately results in a revolution, and therefore the abolition or negation of all classes in a classless society, a kind of communist utopia. Many have argued that this is simply a materialist inversion of Hegel. So, to sum it up, Marx is Hegel turned on its head, turned upside down. So instead of paying attention to the movement of consciousness, as Hegel does, Marx pays attention to the movement of classes and class struggle. And this is where the two are strongly related, and where today's reading of Alexander Kojeve's, the introduction to the reading of Hegel, are going to come together and make clear and crystallize the key point that all three of these thinkers are emphasizing. And that is that recognition is the central most important component of human interaction, but also the composition of human beings themselves as individuals, and also societies and history. Now here I'm going to take a note from Emil Durkheim and not separate any of those things. You can't have an individual without a society, and a society without an individual. You can't have history without people, and you can't have people without history. All of them are sui generis, as Durkheim pointed out, meaning it's not a chicken and egg kind of argument. They all need each other to exist. So let's start off with how Hegel opens up a line of thought which Marx picks up and which Kojeve then develops further on. So Hegel has this really interesting section in which he talks about lordship and bondage. It's commonly referred to as the master-slave dialectic. And I think this is actually the key to Hegel. It's also the key to Marx. And I think it's the key to understanding contemporary political conditions as well. Not only does this help us understand contemporary politics, But even in other fields of study, such as child development, for instance, we can see the Hegelian dialectic of recognition operating. For instance, among American pragmatist thinkers like Cooley or George Herbert Mead, or people who operate in education studies like Piaget. The idea of recognition is central to what it means to be human. And what we mean by that is, how do we know that we are actually independent subjects in the world that have consciousness, that have purpose, and that have meaning? We know these things through the interactions with other human beings. If we are outside of a social setting, the second there's more than one person you're in a social setting, we lose our humanity. Now, what does that mean? Well, for Hegel, it means that we actually don't have recognition. Nobody can see us, and we need to be seen. This is his fundamental claim. This is also the claim made by Kojeve and the claim made by Hegel. But let's take a deeper look at what is meant by this for Hegel. So as I mentioned, let's start off once again with who Hegel is. We think of Hegel as a German idealist philosopher, but he was interested in phenomenology. And phenomenology is simply the way in which we can understand what we know and how we know it. And we know this thing through consciousness, through phenomena. And what knows this phenomena or this consciousness but the subject or the person, right? We don't use the word person in philosophy, but that's what we mean by subject. The second most important thing to know about Hegel, of course, is that he is a dialectician. And he introduces this as being one of the core ways of understanding not just the self, but also politics, culture, and history. And so he talks about the dialectic and the way that the dialectic operates. And what is the dialectic? Well, the dialectic is a somewhat complicated concept, but once you get it, it'll make sense. And that is that there is a thesis, and that this thesis, and we can think of the thesis as being the status quo. What is normal? What is the dominant way of thinking about things? Let's say, what is the dominant political system? For instance, feudalism. And what will happen is something will come up which will contradict that thesis, that A. So what comes up to contradict feudalism? Well, capitalism. And so what happens is that capitalism will destroy feudalism, or it will negate it. But when it destroys it, it does not erase it. It actually overcomes it, to use Hegelian language. What that means is it takes it and it changes it and it consumes it. It makes it a part of itself and generates something new. And this is synthesis. This is C. So A negated by B equals C, which is synthesis. And this is also the movement of history. So capitalism overcomes feudalism, and now capitalism is the thesis. The question becomes, what comes after capitalism? Well, if you're Marx, we know what comes after capitalism. But for Hegel, it wasn't specific political stages like that. It was more about a movement towards consciousness. And for Kojeve, as we're going to see later on, this movement is very clear as well. It's purely political, and it's just about freedom and recognition and the idea of equality. So let's turn to the lordship and bondage dialectic and look at it very closely to try and understand it. So Hegel starts off with this hypothetical consciousness, a person, let's say. Let's say a kind of originary person, and this is a dynamic, so it's not like this is actually the beginning of history that he's talking about, but he sort of does mean it in terms of the beginning of explaining how human consciousness began, and presumably we can say that there was some moment back in time in which the first human being actually went through this process. So what was the process itself? Well, one of the big differentiations that Hegel points to, as well as Marx, that makes human beings different from other animals is that they have consciousness and self-consciousness, that they're not what he calls bare life. They're not just living things. Now, if you're an animal rights person, you're going to take exception to that statement. But, perhaps that is the next stage of the dialectic of history. Hegel didn't see that one coming. But for us, for now, we're just going to assume that only human beings have consciousness and self-consciousness. And so what Hegel says is, there is this first human consciousness. And if you pay attention to how consciousness works, it's really interesting. When you look at an object, there are two moments, Hegel says. There's a moment in which you perceive the object as consciousness, as pure consciousness, and you and the object are the same thing. You're not really separated from it, right? So when you look at a tree or you look at a bush, you are that tree, you are that bush in terms of your consciousness. And then there's a second moment in which you recognize that there's a differentiation between yourself and the tree. You are not the tree, you are you, and the tree is the tree, right? So the tree then is an object, it's a thing outside of you. And so Hegel says that human beings are doing this all the time, and that historically speaking, the first moment of interaction, a human being perceives another human being, and they see it simply as a thing. Just like you would treat an animal, or a tree, or a rock. It is simply bare life. Now you see it's alive, so it's bare life. It's a thing which is alive. Now, another example of this is the newborn. When a baby is very, very young, the assumption that we think, because we don't know what newborn infants actually think, but the assumption is that through how they behave, they can't differentiate between themselves and the external world. And so as they develop, there's a certain stage at which they all of a sudden have recognition that they are persons, that they are independent living creatures, and that you're an independent living creature. That would be a kind of example of that separation between the subject and the object and the idea of self-consciousness. But let's go to the self-consciousness thing, because it's not simply enough for the individual to say, I'm not the tree, or I am not you. Because for human beings to not be simply an object, they need to be recognized by other human beings as not objects. And this is the beginning of the dialect. This is the beginning of the conflict between two self-consciousnesses to be recognized as such. And this is very important, recognition. One must be recognized by another consciousness in order to be free, in order to be real, to be an actual human being. And so Hegel says this sets up a conflict. A conflict emerges because one self-consciousness demands recognition from the other, and so then they start to fight. They come into conflict with one another. And in this conflict, it becomes a life and death struggle, because this is about existence. This is a question of whether or not you are real. And let me make this a political metaphor for a second, because it makes a lot more sense, I think, if I do. If, for instance, you belong to a group of people who exist within a particular country, and that country doesn't recognize your people as existing, there is the very real potential and most probable outcome that you as a people will disappear, right? Either through direct political oppression or perhaps through just simply being completely ignored, right? So these are the ideas of, for instance, self-determination and minority rights that we see in this particular political moment of kind of liberalism. Now, on an individual level, Hegel argues that this is the same condition. When you run it, and let's imagine you're out in the wilderness at some point, at some hypothetical point in history, and you come into contact with another human being. You don't know each other. There's no civilization. There are no norms by which you two can encounter. Instead, you see one another, and you recognize that you're not just simply animals or objects, and therefore you engage immediately in a kind of struggle to be recognized as human, as the real true self, and also as free. This leads to a fight to the death. And this is where the dialectic all of a sudden kicks in. So you have these two consciousnesses, that are demanding recognition from the other. This is symmetry. They're actually equal, right? But oddly enough, this moment of complete symmetry leads to asymmetry, because one of those two is human and the other is not, and it becomes human through the conflict itself and through the surrendering, the submission to the other. So this is the beginning of the lordship and bondage dialectic. Two subjects come into conflict with one another. They are both demanding to be masters or to be recognized, to be seen as free. One of them actually knows that they are human. This is so clever. The one who understands that they are human and they are mortal, who experience fear, submits, and they become the servant or slave. Now, one would think that they would lose their humanity in that moment. But ironically enough, and here's the dialectic, ironically enough, it is the slave who becomes human in that moment because they experience fear and self-consciousness, and they can recognize the master or the lord as an actual self-consciousness. And so then the lord and the master, oddly enough, in their demand for recognition, loses their humanity, loses their recognition, because they do not see the slave, do not see the one that they have forced into submission as human. And again, political metaphors make perfect sense here. If we think about, let's say, a minority within a large nation state that is somehow politically oppressed, how does, let's say, the powers that be or the dominant group perceive those individuals or that group or that ethnicity? They see them as, oftentimes this is the rhetoric, as inhuman or they're dehumanized, right? But who is being dehumanized in that process of oppression? Well, it's the people doing the oppression. So there are very real political contemporary correlates to what Hegel is talking about here. So the Lord becomes, therefore, not human, right? Because they are constantly seeking this kind of recognition, and so what they constantly are doing is forcing other people to submit to their domination, and so it becomes this endless cycle of conquest. And the Lord, further, doesn't work. They don't produce them anything. Once they force this other consciousness to submit, and they are forced into bondage. Here we have serfs, or we have slaves. The serfs or the slaves, or the worker in a Marxist interpretation, are the ones who are transforming the world and actually sustaining the master. So the master is actually dependent upon the slave, both for recognition and consciousness as a free, pure being, but actually for their material existence. So a complete inversion happens in which the slave, or the consciousness that is forced into bondage, is the one that becomes truly human and that actually sustains the master materially, but not metaphysically, because, of course, the master cannot be recognized by someone that they are oppressing or exploiting or taking advantage of. So that's Hegel's lordship and bondage dialectic. Kojeve takes what Hegel's saying, and he makes some other claims which I think are very interesting. And he's really taking Hegel, who again is a philosopher, and we can interpret him in various ways, as many people have. And there are many interpretations one can make of Hegel's master-slave dialectic. But Kojeve translates it into a particular kind of political discourse, which makes, I think, very good sense, certainly in the 20th century when he was doing his writing and thinking, but makes, I think, as much sense today in the 21st century as it did back then. And he sees the dialectic as a historical movement towards total equality. So the moment that history began, he calls it universal history. History began for Kojeve with this moment of domination, this moment of political oppression, this moment in which one group or one person or one class uses violence to conquer and oppress and exploit some other class, group of people, or individual. This is the beginning of history. And so the history is about political struggle and the movement towards the negation of oppression and the reign of total freedom for all. And history will end when we are all free or equal, when we are all recognized by one another, as, for instance, Hegel says the master and slave are demanding in their own struggle for bare life. And Kojeve on page 43 ends this dialectic with, as he says here, consequently, quote, history stops at the moment when the difference, the opposition between master and slave disappears, at the moment when the master will cease to be master, because he will no longer have a slave, and the slave will cease to be slave because he will no longer have a master. Parentheses, although the slave will not become master in turn, since he will have no slave, end parentheses, period. And Kojeve does us the favor of actually analyzing world history in terms of this master-slave dialectic. And he says there are three periods that we can understand human history, as he calls it, universal history. This is actually helpful for us. So he says the first period is the history of the master. And what is the master doing? The master is enslaving people. So we can think of ancient history as this. The ancient Egyptians, they had slaves. The ancient Greeks, they had slaves. The ancient Assyrians, they had slaves. The ancient Nubian kingdoms in Africa, they had slaves. Ancient history is defined by slavery. It's defined by oppression. He says then there's a second period in which essentially masters and slaves negate each other. Unlike the previous period in which it is the sort of period of the master in which the master determines human existence. So it's the pharaohs of Egypt that determine the course of Egyptian civilization. It's the Roman emperors who are enslaving entire peoples in Europe who determine the course of Roman culture. It's Socrates and Plato who are the free citizens of these ancient Greek city-states who have slaves. They are the masters who determine the culture and the direction of humanity during that period of time. So unlike the period of the master, the second period, right, is a dialectic of master and slavery. And this we can think of as being a period of conflict. This is the Enlightenment. This is the Haitian Revolution. This is the Civil Rights Movement. This is women's movements, for gender equality, etc. All of those types of struggles in which there is a push for equality is a battle, is a synthesis between master and slave, between those who have power and are oppressing and exploiting and controlling, and those who don't and who are struggling against them. That is the second period. He says eventually this period will end. This will be the end of the slavish existence, and so the end of history will be the synthesis of master and slavery, and we can understand that synthesis as being a movement towards its realizing its own possibilities of the self. In other words, the end of history, or the end of this struggle of political oppression, will result in a moment in which we as individuals, but also humanity as a kind of universal history, will be oriented towards our potentials, towards what we can be, what we can become. And so there he's taking a page from Marx and the idea that Marx had of species being, right? Which goes back to the idea of work and labor as well. So we see the ways in which Kojeve, Marx, and Hegel all get tied together. They get tied together along this path of recognition, the idea that there's a struggle between two things, whether it's a master and slave, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or oppressor and oppressed, and that work is essential to this process as well as recognition. You must be recognized, but also work itself is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. It's how we become human. This is true for Hegel, and it's true for Marx. For Marx, it's our species being, it's our creativity. How we transform the world is how we become who we are internally, in terms of our potential selves. And so Kojeve takes that as well and runs with it, and he ends history at that moment. And this is kind of going to be a perfect kind of society, a perfect kind of universal end to history, in which everybody is free. And what are we working on? We're working on ourselves. We're working on being who we should be. This is the romantic self. Right? This is the romantic self, the self in which there is some kind of hidden genius within all of us that is just simply waiting to come out. And if it wasn't for the external structures which were preventing us from developing our true selves, we would all be poets and artists and writers and painters and physicists and scientists. Right? So in sum, we can see the ways in which Hegel, Marx, and Kojeve all agree on certain principles and thoughts concerning consciousness, concerning the master-slave dialectic, and also the centrality of labor. But the ways also in which they diverge are numerous as well. I just want to emphasize that Kojeve specifically is taking Hegel and Marx and making it a political project as opposed to Marx's rendition, which is really an economic project. There's a political dimension to it. But for Marx, it's really just about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. As he said, class struggle is the engine of history. For Kojeve, it's not class struggle, it's political struggle. It's a struggle for recognition. For Kojeve, that is the key. Recognition is central to this process. So Kojeve actually brings us back closer to Hegel, whereas Marx remains really a materialist and really interested in the ways in which the material conditions of production, and et cetera, establish the various kinds of political as well as economic and cultural domains. So having said that, hopefully this makes a little bit more sense to you now. If you're interested in doing a little bit of a deeper dive, be sure to read Kojeve's piece called The Introduction to the Reading of Hegel by Alexander Kojeve, Lectures on the Phenomenology of Spirit. Or you could read Hegel himself, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And in terms of Marx, I mean, there's just so much to read there, I can't even tell you where to begin. But I would start actually with Kojeve and then maybe work your way back through Hegel and then go to Marx. Thanks.